Has someone hurt you? Like, do you want to get back at them? Well, today we're going to finish our story about Esther, and we're going to learn some valuable lessons about how God is really, really good at taking care of our enemies for us. In today's lesson, we're going to be reminded that God is really powerful, but He's also really personal, and He cares about the things that we care about, and He cares about all the details in our lives. So join us today for Let God Handle That For You. Good morning and welcome to our Women's Bible Study. We are super glad you're joining us today. For those of you, if you're new and you want to know more about our ministry, go online to womensbiblestudy.com. There you get handouts for today's lessons. You can learn everything you want to know about us, which is you can watch us lots of different ways. We want you to be able to watch Bible study anytime, anywhere. That's kind of our goal for what we do here. Today, we're going to finish out a story from our Been There, Done That series. We want to talk today about a woman by the name of Esther. We met her last week, so we're going to finish out today. We started this Been There, Done That series because we want to learn from the people in the Bible. And when we do that, it helps us grow in our faith because then we learn to trust God more because we see how they trusted God. So that's kind of the whole point to her story. So today, we're going to finish the story, and we're going to learn some great reminders of, here you go, how awesome, powerful, and personal God is. So let's catch up really quick from last week. Last week we did kind of a history lesson. We talked about the Jewish nation as a whole. This group of people, all the way back to Abraham in the Bible. This is where the Jews came from, the Israelites. If you read the Old Testament, that's who they are. God gave them this land of Israel. This land would produce a Messiah, which you know and I know as Jesus. Jesus was born in Israel. Jesus died on a cross in Israel. Jesus will come back again and rule and reign from Israel. So, Israel and the Israelites are Jews. They're a theme or the focal point of the entire Bible. And if you read the Bible, just always remember that as you're going through it, that they are kind of the reason for the Bible because that's where Jesus would come from. So last week we did this whole history lesson thing, and we tried to go over why all these foreign countries are always trying to wipe Israel off of the map. From Moses going in to get them out of Egypt to the Holocaust, and all times in between, people want Israel gone. And it always makes me laugh because here's what I say. Anyone who goes up against Israel is really fighting God, and they will not win. So last week, we started this with Esther, and like I said, we did this big history lesson, because the time of Esther, the book of Esther was written at a time, one of those time periods, when someone wanted to annihilate the Jews off of the earth. And the story about Esther is how God used her, a Jewish woman, to make sure that did not happen. So, we used her story as kind of like an example of like a movie, and we kind of have been going over all the characters. So last week we met Queen Vashti, but she's no longer the queen. We now have met Queen Esther. She has become the new queen. We have King Xerxes over here. And then we met two other characters. Mordecai, he's the good guy. He's the Jew. He is Esther's cousin. And then we meet the bad guy over here, Haman, as you can see with the thumbs down. He's kind of the bad guy. He wants to wipe the Jews off of the face of the earth. Now, overarching all of this is even though God's name is never mentioned in this book, we know there was a director behind the whole scene, and we know that is God. And He's the directing all these people to make sure that they're at the right place at the right time. So we're going to play our cute little video to catch you up on the story. In case you weren't here last week, we're going to go to where we stopped, and then we'll pick that back up in just a minute.
Esther's story takes place during the years of the Jewish exile, around 470 BC. Now the Jews had been defeated by Babylon, which meant they were exiled from their homeland and taken as slaves. But later, the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians. So now, the Jews found themselves under the rule of the Persian king, Xerxes. That's where our story begins. King Xerxes decided he was going to throw a party. And this wasn't your standard cookies and punch type of party. This party lasted for 7 days and included all manner of lavish feasting and drinking. Now on the last day, the king decided to show off his queen, who was very beautiful. But when he called for her to come to the feast, she refused. This greatly angered the king. And not only the king, but his counselors and noblemen as well. Because they were thinking, if the queen treats the king this way, wives everywhere are going to start disrespecting their husbands. They're going to be mouthing off, refusing to change the baby. They're not going to cook the falafel for dinner. It's going to be chaos. So the king declared that the queen was no longer the queen, which meant that he needed to find a new one. Now, if you're an all-powerful male in the ancient world, what better way to find a new wife than to parade every beautiful single woman in the land through your palace? So that's what he did. Among the hundreds of women sent to the palace was a girl named Esther. Esther was secretly a Jew, and she was also an orphan raised by her uncle Mordecai. And though she was essentially the lowest possible social class, the Lord was with Esther, and she was a beautiful and graceful woman. When she was brought to the palace, she found favor among all the king's staff, and ultimately the king himself, who chose her to be queen. Sometime later, Esther's uncle Mordecai was sitting at the city gate when he overheard 2 men plotting to kill the king. Mordecai quickly relayed this to Esther, who told the king, who promptly solved the problem. Even though he saved the king's life, Mordecai was never recognized for what he did. And sometime later, he found himself in trouble when a man named Haman rose to power. Haman was the king's second in command, and whenever Haman walked through the streets, everyone was ordered to bow down before him. But Mordecai, being a Jew and a follower of God, refused to bow to Haman. When Haman found out about it, he was enraged. In fact, he was so enraged that he plotted to kill not only Mordecai, but every single Jew in the empire, women and children included. By Haman's influence, the king sent out a decree that ordered all Jews to be executed and their property taken. When Mordecai found out about it, he begged Esther to approach the king and ask him to change his mind. But Esther knew that if she were to approach the king without being summoned, she could, by law, be put to death. Esther was in torment, but finally, after much fasting and praying, she decided to approach the king, even if she should perish.
Okay, so last week we stopped with something that Esther taught us. And it's this: do something. Do something. She had to go and speak with the king. But she knew that if she did that, she could possibly be put to death if the king was in a bad mood, because he hadn't called on her for 30 days. And if she just showed up, then he could say, I don't want her around anymore. So that was what she had to weigh to see if that was a smart thing to do or not. But she also knew that her Jewish people were about ready to be annihilated. So she needed to do something. She could not just sit around in the palace just hoping things would get better. Here's what she did. She had to make a choice to move forward. So at the time we pick up the story, she's fasting and praying, and so is Mordecai over here and all the Jews that he knows. Because without Esther going to the king, the Jews would all die. That's just how this was. Here's what else Esther teaches us. Be patient. Now I realize this, that I'm nothing like Esther when it comes to this. If I got news that my entire people group was about to be put to death, I would not be very patient. I would rush in. I'd be like, oh, king, you have to take care of this now. Haman, your right-hand guy, he's a bad guy. He's trying to kill my people. And P.S., he's horribly mean to my cousin Mordecai. I want you to put him to death. Okay, that's what I would do. But that's not what she does. Okay? I realize with this with Rob, when I feel like I need to tell him something, my first reaction is like, I don't want to be patient. I want to just run in and tell him what I need to tell him right off the bat. I'm like, we have to talk now. But Esther, I learned this great, valuable lesson from her, that we don't have to do that. Because Esther has so much wisdom. And God really led her to take this process really, really slowly with the king. Because remember, she's kind of new queen. She's new to this whole thing. So look what she does. Let's watch our little video.
When the king saw her standing before him, he loved her and invited her to speak. "What do you wish, Esther?" the king asked. Esther replied, "I would ask that the king and Haman come to a feast that I shall prepare." The king was delighted, as was Haman, and together they feasted. Toward the end of the meal, the king asked Esther, "What is it that you wish? Anything you want will be granted to you, up to half my kingdom." Esther replied, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to another feast that I will prepare, and there I will answer the king's question."
So Esther puts on a banquet. But then she asks the king over here and Haman, the bad guy, to come back to another one the next day. Now, at this point, why she delays her request, it doesn't make any sense to us at all. Because we're like, come on, Esther, let's go. Let's get this show on the road. Get it done. But it was clearly a God thing to put on her heart to not do that. Because in her mind, she started thinking, and I think this is what God really impressed upon her, she needed to have a first banquet. To maybe remind the king, hey, remember me? I'm Esther. I'm your wife. I'm the new queen. He hadn't called her for 30 days, so she didn't know where she stood with him. Maybe the king just needed to see her courage, that she was willing to risk her life to come and talk to him. Maybe she just needed to make sure that he would be okay with her if she was going to spring this whole, bad news on him. But the greatest part about the story, and she didn't even know this at the time, but God needed that extra night, because it was that night that would change the course of everything in this whole story. God would be working. So let's talk over here about our bad guy, Haman. Haman's the bad guy in the story. He's second in command to the king. He's a man who's been there and done that. He's racist. He's mean. He's prideful. So in our Been There, Done That series, what we want to learn is how not to be like Haman. But for Haman, he was most likely an Amalekite, and they were longtime enemies of the Jewish people. So for him, his racism towards the Jews was probably passed down from generation to generation for him. But at this point, he's really proud of himself. He has become second in command to the king. And using his connection with the king, what he decided to do was he wants to get rid of all the Jews. So we see this in Esther 3:13. He asked the king, we need to destroy these people. Here's what it says. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. That is what Haman asked the king to do, and that was what was set in motion. So Queen Esther has invited Haman and the king to not just one banquet, but two. And so for Haman over here, his life is perfect. His life is perfect in his own eyes, except for one person, this guy, Mordecai, Esther's cousin, because he's a Jew. Remember, Haman hates Jews. Haman hates Mordecai because Mordecai refuses to bow down to him when he walks by, because Mordecai, being a Jew, is like, I bow down to God. That's what I do. Now, for most people, when someone doesn't like us, we're like, oh, that person doesn't like me, whatever, and then we move on. We don't go on a murderous rampage and try to kill their families and friends just because they don't like us. But for Haman, his pride was not about to let someone disrespect him. This made me laugh. Pride shows its colors in lots of different ways. I thought this was funny. This guy writes, he says, I was on my way to work. I stopped by a Dunkin' Donuts. He says, I go through the drive-thru, I say to the window, or the woman at the window, I'll have 3 cake donuts and a cup of coffee. She starts mumbling. He says, I can't hear her. And I thought, well, she may be able to hear me if she would just open her stupid window. But it was early. He said I had to have my coffee, and I was getting annoyed. And the reason why I was annoyed was kind of prideful. I'm the customer. You're there to serve me. You're there to make me happy. And I'm just not very happy right now. Again, he yells, cake, donuts, and coffee. He hears her mumbling through the glass. And I thought, am I going to have to stick my head out the window and yell into the store to tell her what I want? And he thought, well, okay, I'm going to do that. And as he did that, smack, his head hit the window. She had not forgotten to pull her window open, but he had forgotten to roll his window down. He said he hit his head so hard, he's like, I just saw stars. The woman started laughing. She thought it was so funny, and he was completely embarrassed. But pride it comes in all different colors. And a lot of it starts with thinking, we're right, they're wrong, I'm better, they're not. And that was one example. Here's another example. During the Civil War, Union General John Sedgwick was inspecting his troops. At one point, he came to a low wall in which he gazed out in the direction of the enemy. His officer suggested that was really, really unwise. Like, you probably shouldn't do that. You need to stay below the wall and duck. He, thinking he has this great army and he knows everything, he says, that's nonsense. They couldn't hit an elephant at that distance. And just then he got shot and he was fatally wounded. See, pride just comes in so many different colors. Chad Prather tells a story of his pride. He says he was doing something on the computer when it crashed. He lost all of his work. But he walked downstairs to his wife, Vanessa, and he says, I was just amazed at my good attitude. She said, oh my gosh, you just lost all that work on the computer. And he said, you know what? The computer certainly saves me a lot of time, but I can't complain if it wants to take some stuff back now and then. She said, wow, it's amazing how calm you are and how happy you seem, even though you've lost all of your work. You just have a really great attitude. She left the room, and he thought, she's right. I do have a really great attitude. Instead of ranting and raving, I just accepted it and moved on. That's good. In fact, that's mature. In fact, that's how Jesus would have responded. Later on, his kids did something they shouldn't have, and his wife got upset, and then he forgot something, and his wife got upset. And he said to himself, I had this great attitude this morning. What's wrong with her? Why can't she just roll with the punches? So he said, being the one with the more mature attitude, he felt it was his duty to lecture his wife on how rotten her attitude had become. He said, do you see how pride is conceived? That morning I may have been Christ-like, but by evening I had become a prideful Pharisee. In other words, pride is just this idea that I'm just better than you, I'm more spiritual than you, I'm more athletic, I'm liked more, I have more money, I. And here's what it says, that makes us look down on others, and that is pride. And see, that's exactly what Haman was doing to the Jewish people. Looking down on them. They're less than me. I'm better than them. But like Solomon says, Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And Haman is about ready to fall big time. So look what he does between this first banquet and the second banquet the next day. Esther 5 verse 9, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the way the king had honored him and how he had elevated himself above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But look at this next verse. Verse 13, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. And you're like, what? Like you have everything and this guy is bothering you that much? See, that's like saying, I will never be happy, even though God has given me so much, if that person gets pregnant and I don't. I will never be happy, even though God has given me so much, if that person gets the promotion and I don't. I will never be happy, even though God has given me so much, if that person gets married and I never find someone. See, if you ever hear yourself saying things like that, I want you always to remember the story of Haman, because that's how it all started. He had everything. He had everything. And yet, the one man that would not bow down to him and give him what he thought he deserved ruined his life. Verse 14. Here's a really good wife for you. So his wife Zeresh and all her friends said to him, have gallows built. Really? 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. I just can't even imagine the scene. Haman has everything. The closeness to the king, a good family, money, and yet he thinks building a gallows and hanging the one person that he can't stand is even a good idea. It's just so funny how messed up we can be. I thought this was cute. A woman was looking out her window every morning. She always commented on the dirty laundry on their neighbor's line. One day she noticed it was sparkling clean and she looked at her husband and she said, maybe she's using a new detergent. And her husband says, no, actually, I just got up and cleaned our windows this morning. But that's the thing. Sometimes we just need to clean our own windows so we can see clearly out there, because Haman was not doing that at all. He's about to learn something that Solomon teaches us in Proverbs 26:27. If a man digs a pit, he will fall into it. If a man rolls a stone, it will roll back on him. It's a valuable lesson that we can all learn from Haman, who has been there and done that. Here's something we can learn. Let's be grateful for what God has given us, regardless of if someone has more than we do or has better things than we do. Because what we're going to see is that God is so big that he can turn the tables at any time he needs to. Even when God seems silent, he's always working. Never forget that. God will do things that need to be done in his own timetable. And what we learn so valuably is that in this next section, it's this reminder that God can move in a day if he needs to. Time is like, well, what happens in a week? I don't know. God can do something in a day. Like we're all in this election period, and I don't know. God can change everything in a day. Like in one day, we'll know actually who wins the presidency. Like it's just one day. God can do anything. Esther 6 verse 1. That night, the night before the second banquet, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. I think this is one of the greatest verses in the Bible. And you're like, what? Why would that be great? I'm like, think about this. The night before, wicked Haman is going to hang Mordecai on the gallows. God makes sure the king can't sleep. He makes sure the king is restless. He's like, I just need to go to sleep, and I don't have any sleeping pills, so what do I do? So this is what he does. He asks for the Chronicles to be brought to him. But while he's restless, he has no idea what Haman is planning. None. But it's just a reminder that God is so powerful that he can always override what we want with what he wants. Sometimes we forget that he is really that powerful. And I think when we get that, it changes how we view everything, how we view the relationships, how we view what's going on with our kids. It changes how we view about the elections or the world or what's going on when we go, okay, God is really that big that he's in control of this whole thing. And just like, none of these people knew what was going on at the beginning. But God knows something. He sees something that's going on in the future, which is why he brings Esther into the story. And no one really even knows why. But there's always an overarching picture. Look at Job, verse 12, chapter 12. Job, of course, lost everything. And this is what he says. He reminds us of how powerful God is. Verse 9, he says, "For they all know that my disaster has come from the hand of the Lord. he had enough sense to know the bad stuff in his life wasn't just random, that God wanted to use that. He's saying, all of this has come from the hand of the Lord. And see, I think once we get that in our brains, like, okay, this bad thing happened, this tragedy happened, it came from the hand of the Lord because God wants to do something with it. That's why it's so important to know God so well. Verse 10, for the life of every living thing is in his hand, and the breath of every human being. But true wisdom and power are found in God. Counsel and understanding are his. What he destroys cannot be rebuilt. When he puts someone in prison, there is no escape. If he holds back the rain, the earth becomes a desert. If he releases the water, they flood the earth. Yes, strength and wisdom are his. Deceivers and deceived are both in his power. I say that because we just had the election. And it doesn't matter who you're for because the country's split half and half in that way. But someone's being deceived and someone is a deceiver. And God is reminding us that they are both in his hand. Just like he used wickedness to bring something to light for Haman, God can do the exact same thing with these elections. I don't know how it's going to come out. I really don't. But I do know when I read that verse that the deceivers and the deceived are both in his hands. That's very comforting to me right now. He leads counselors away, stripped of good judgment. Wise judges become fools. He removes the royal robe of kings. They're led away with ropes around their waists. It's like, I can do anything to kings, presidents, anyone on this earth. He leads priests away, stripped of status. He overthrows those with long years and power. He silences the trusted advisors and removes the insight of the elders. He pours disgrace upon princes and disarms the strong. He uncovers mysteries hidden in darkness. He brings light to the deepest gloom. Some of you feel right now that it's very gloomy. And God's like, you know what? I'm going to uncover mysteries and bring light to the deepest gloom. He builds up nations and he destroys them. He expands nations and he abandons them. He strips kings of understanding and leaves them wandering in a pathless wasteland. See, that is the God that you and I serve. And when we really understand that, it changes how we view everything on this earth. But not only that, it reminds me of the story of how personal God is. I can't tell you how many business deals that God has saved us from doing in the middle of the night, just like he did with this king. Rob would wake up in the middle of the night, and he'd wake me up the next morning. He'd be like, God just made it very clear to me last night that we are not to do this business deal. And it was always such a blessing that happened. But this verse just always reminds me of the closeness and the nearness of God to you and I. So the king is restless. He has someone bring him this book that chronicled all the things that went on during his reign. To me, it would be the most boring book on earth. But I think he brought it in hopes that it would just lull him to sleep. But as the guy is reading it to the king, suddenly something jolts his attention. Look at verse 2. He says it was found recorded there that Mordecai, remember Mordecai over here? We saw this last week. He exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. We saw that in last week's story. We said, hey, hold on to that thought. We'll deal with it now. But this was something that happened when Esther first became queen. And Mordecai stops. He overhears these guys plotting the assassination. He goes and tells Esther. Esther tells the king, and the bad guys are hung. But remember we said last week, Mordecai was never honored at all for saving the king's life. It's like God just kind of blocked it from anyone's thought process. And it probably didn't even make sense to Mordecai at the time. But it's just a reminder that whatever's going on in your life today, just always remember this scene. God does not forget even if people do. God does not forget. Once again, God is always in the background. He kept them from honoring Mordecai back then for such a time as this, because he needed this to happen when he was restless this particular one night. See, God does not forget even if people do. If you don't get that recognition at work, if you don't get that recognition at school, if you don't get that recognition from that guy, instead of letting it bother you, do what Mordecai did. Just like, hey, hand it over to God. It doesn't matter. And here's what you need to know. If God needs to do something, with that at a later date, he will remember. That's how big God is. So the king says this, hey, this guy Mordecai saved my life. Look at verse 3. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. And they said, nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. By this time it's morning. And the king asks this. He's like, verse 4, the king said, who's in the court? Now Haman, bad guy over there, just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai, the guy who he's about ready to honor because he saved his life, on the gallows he had erected for him. Remember, Haman over there is on his own little mission. He had gallows built all night long. And today was the day he was going to walk in and talk to the king about hanging Mordecai. But here's the problem. They were both on completely different pages. I thought this was cute. This was a story about a group of people that were all on completely different pages. An old Italian man lived alone in New Jersey. He wanted to plant his annual tomato garden, but the ground was really hard and it was just really too difficult for him to do. His only son, Vincent, who used to help him, was now in prison. And so the old man wrote a letter to his son and described his predicament. He said, Dear Vincent, I'm feeling pretty sad because it looks like I won't be able to plant my tomato garden this year. I'm just getting too old. I'm getting too old to be digging up a garden plot. I know if you were here, though, all my troubles would be over. I know you would be happy to dig up the ground for me, just like the old days. Love, Papa. A few days later, he received a letter from his son, Vincent. Dear Pop, don't dig up that garden. That's where the bodies are buried. Love, Vinny. At 4 a.m. the next morning, FBI agents and local police arrived at the house, dug up the entire area without finding any bodies. They apologized to the old man and left. The same day, the man received another letter from his son. Dear Pop, go ahead and plant the tomatoes now. Now I could get the police to dig up the garden for you. That's the best I could do under these circumstances. Love, Vinny. I love that. I thought that was so cute because everyone is on a different page regarding this tomato garden. But I think it's the same with the king and Haman. They were both on completely different pages regarding Mordecai. Because Haman has no idea what just happened during the night. And here's what you and I know happened. God happened. God happened. God kept the king awake. God brought to the king's attention what Mordecai did to save his life. And just in the nick of time. Never forget that. God is really good at waiting until the last minute when it looks and feels hopeless. In 1924, Dallas Theological Seminary almost went bankrupt. On the day it was to foreclose at noon, Dr. Harry Ironside, the president, held a prayer meeting in his office. Here was his prayer. Lord, we know the cattle on 1,000 hills are yours. Please sell some and give us the money. As he prayed with some of the staff, a tall Texas oilman walked into the receptionist's office, told the secretary, I just sold 2 carloads of cattle in Fort Worth. I've been trying to make this business deal go through and it won't work, so I've just, for some reason, been compelled to give this money to the seminary. I don't know if you need this, but here's the check. The secretary burst into the room where the men were praying and said to Dr. Ironside, Harry, God just sold the cattle. But it was always at the last minute. God does that. And I don't know why, except it makes us crazy. But sometimes I think he waits on purpose so that we get to the point where there's nowhere else to turn. And then when he miraculously answers our prayers, then we know it could be nobody else but God. And then he gets all the glory for it. See, it works perfectly. Which is about to happen with Esther and Mordecai. So the king realizes he never honored Mordecai for saving his life. Haman is walking in all high and mighty. Great mood because he knows today's the day Mordecai is going to get hung. So verse 5 says this. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. This is the funniest scene ever. Verse 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he thinks the king is going to be talking about himself. So he knows the king is pleased with him, he thinks, and so he gives this laundry list of things that he really wants for himself. Verse 7 says this, so he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on a horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man who the king delights to honor. Because Haman, bad Haman, can just picture himself. He can picture himself being led through the streets, everyone bowing down to him because that's how high and mighty Haman is on himself. And then comes this, verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded him, Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai. Mordecai the Jew, like his total enemy that he wants to hang and kill that day. The king's like, go do that for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. Can you imagine what's going through Haman's mind? He's like, what just happened? I thought this was going to be about me, but apparently it's not. So verse 11, so Haman got the robe and the horse, and he robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man who the king delights to honor. Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman, bad Haman, rushed home with his head covered in grief. He's like totally devastated by what just happened. He had to wander Mordecai around the city. He hates him. So Haman comes home and says this to his wife. He told Zeresh's wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. They're not very encouraging to him. And then verse 14, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. Now it makes sense. Now it makes sense why Esther didn't just blurt out everything to the king. Now it makes sense why she had 2 banquets and not 1. Because God was still not done working. And he needed to be prepared for what she was about ready to tell him. But I wonder how she knew to do that. How does she know to have 2 banquets instead of 1? And I think it's because she had an open heart and a surrendered heart to listen. Not just, God, this is what I'm going to do, and go in guns blazing because I hate Haman, and God, I need you to bless this whole thing. I don't think that's really how it happened. I think she really spent time fasting and praying, focusing not on what she wanted, but what God wanted. And she had an open heart to listen for what God had to say. And I go, okay, well, how did that happen? Maybe it was just a thought. Maybe God just put a thought into her brain, like have 2 banquets. Maybe it was just peace. Maybe she's like, 2 banquets sound like a good idea. And she had peace about it. Maybe she got counsel from the people who knew the king the best. I don't know, because remember this. God wants to speak to us. He wants us to hear him. So often we think like, well, God's silent and he doesn't have anything to say and he doesn't really want to talk to me. That's not true. He really does want to tell you what he wants you to do. All right. So Haman is furious. And he's on his way now to Esther's second banquet. Esther 7 says this, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. And now Esther is ready to talk to the king. Then Queen Esther answered in verse 3, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. I love how she presents this. If this were just about my people being slaves, then I get it, but this is not. King, you need to listen to me. Like, my people, me, I'm a Jew. You may not even know that, King, but I'm a Jew. And you know what? Our whole people are going to be killed. But King, you can stop this. I would never, ever bother you if I didn't think for 1 minute that you could stop this. Verse 5 says, as King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? The king is clueless. He apparently has no idea that Esther's Jewish. He's already forgotten that Haman, the bad guy, put this edict out to kill the Jews. And suddenly I think King Xerxes is putting it all together. Verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and enemy is, here you go, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, went into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. And for Haman, it's about to get worse. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king explained, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. Remember the gallows that he wanted to kill Mordecai on? He's made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king, and the king says, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's fury subsided. Remember Proverbs 26:27. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. I say this, whoever builds a gallows for someone else, you will get hung on it. That's my own version of that. So here's what we can learn from Haman, the bad guy. That he had a position. He was second in command to the king. He could have served the king really, really well. He could have had the king's best interest at heart. But instead, here you go, he abused his authority. The lesson for us is to recognize that God has always placed all of us in an authority position. It could be authority over your children or your grandchildren. You could be the boss and you could have authority over people at your work. You could have a ministry and you could have authority over people in your ministry. You could have a dog. You could have authority over your dog. But just like Haman, there's always this temptation to abuse what God has given you. And so what happens is people lord it over their children instead of shepherding them. Like, I'm telling you what to do and you do it because I tell you so and I'm the boss and no one's going to, I'm the one that tells you what you have to do. We can go to work and to our employees and we can be rude and unkind just because we have the authority. We can be a youth pastor and force kids to obey a list of church rules because you know what? I have the authority to do that. Or you can tell your dog to go outside and he doesn't listen, you can kick him because you have the authority. Our job is to be in authority, but to do what Jesus did. He served others in humility, caring more for them than himself. Now take that back to raising your kids or loving your dog or being a youth pastor or a business owner. It's all about serving them. Being in a position of power says, I'm going to serve them. I'm not going to lord it over them and tell them what they have to do. Chuck Swindoll tells a really funny story about this exact thing. There was a man named Walter. Walter went to work for one of the largest corporations in the world. The personnel director told Walter, you have to start at the bottom. You have to work your way up. So he started in the mail room. Walter liked his job, but he always dreamed about what it would like to be the executive, the president, maybe even the chairman of the board of this big company. One day, Walter was dividing the mail and he saw a cockroach in the corner. He walked over to step on it, but then he heard this tiny voice said, don't kill me, don't kill me. I'm Milton the cockroach. If you spare me, I'll grant all of your wishes. Walter agreed. That was a pretty good arrangement. So he spared Milton the cockroach's life. Walter's first wish was to leave the mailroom and become vice president, so Milton granted him that wish. In fact, Milton granted wish after wish until finally Walter was chairman of the board. He had an office at the top floor of the tallest building in the whole world. Everyone looked up to Walter. He was very happy. Walter often said to himself, "I'm Walter, and I'm at the top, and no one is more important than me." Then one day, Walter heard footsteps on the roof. He went up to find a little boy kneeling and praying. Walter says, "Are you praying to me?" He said, "After all, I'm the chairman of the board of the largest corporation in the world." The boy says, "Oh, no, I'm praying to God." Walter was quite disturbed by the chain of events. So he sent for Milton the cockroach. He said, "I have another wish. I want to be like God." And so Milton granted Walter's wish. And the next day, Walter was back in the mailroom. Because that's what it's all about. It's so different. It's about serving. The way up is the way down. Following Jesus is about emptying ourselves of ourself. It's not about me. It's about others, putting them first. And that's how Mordecai always was about his people and Esther. He loved the Jewish people. He never bowed down to Haman because he bowed only to his God. He loved Esther, so proud of her. And because of that kind of a heart, look what happens to him. Esther 8 says this on 1. On that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the bad guy who's now dead, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. Here's the one lesson that we need to end with today. Often evil people look like they are getting away with their evil. Often evil people, they just look like they're getting away with it. They never seem to get caught. And even though Mordecai could see right through Haman, you can see right through that person who is just so bad right now. But always know this: God takes down evil people in his own time and in his own way. The business partner that stole from you, and he seems to have a mansion on the beachfront. The husband who abandoned you for that younger model. The friend who betrayed you and turned all your friends away. Here's what King David says, and I think Mordecai and Esther would agree. Psalms 37, "Don't worry about the wicked or envy those who do wrong. For guess what? Like grass, they soon fade. Like spring flowers, they soon wither." In other words, stop worrying about them. Instead, do this. Verse 3, "Trust in the Lord and do good. Then you will live safely in the land and prosper. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desire. Commit everything you do to the Lord. Trust him, and he will help you." Verse 6, "He will make your innocence radiate like the dawn, and the justice of your cause will shine like the noonday sun. Be still in the presence of the Lord and wait patiently for him to act. Don't worry about the evil people who prosper or fret about their wicked schemes. Stop being angry. Turn from your rage. Do not lose your temper. It only leads to harm. For the wicked will be destroyed, but those who trust in the Lord will possess the land. Soon the wicked will disappear. Though you look for them, they're going to be gone. The wicked plot against the godly. They snarl at them in defiance, but the Lord just laughs, for he sees their day of judgment coming." See, God thinks so differently about life and people than we do. Here's how I want to end. Here's what we learn about Haman. This is what we need to learn about the Hamans that are in our life. We know this: in the end, God wins. God wins. So we need to learn to do what Mordecai did with Haman. Just give him over to God. Let God take care. Trust your enemies to God, because God will take care of them for you. If not in this life, we know for sure in the next life. So I just want to remind you, through this whole story of Esther, of how awesome, powerful, and personal God is to us. Father, thank you so much for this story. God, for those that just cannot get past that person who hurt them, I pray that today's story will be a reminder that you are always working behind the scenes. You see things we don't see. And God, you will take care of them for us. I pray that we will be able to move on past that, laying these people at your feet so we can move on with life with joy and peace and loving you through the whole process. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a good week.